Hello and welcome to a brief tutorial on how to make effective academic posters. This tutorial is aimed at students in science, technology, engineering, and math specifically. So what is a research poster? A research poster is a visual representation of a summary of your research project. Generally, it's a mix of text, although that text is very abbreviated, alongside of visual representations of your data, such as tables, graphs, pictures, etc. The most important thing to remember is that this is only a summary of the most important aspects of your project. It's impossible to fit all the details and all the data from your project into a poster. So where should you begin when starting to create a poster? Well, a good place to start would be our website. That's the Undergraduate Research Center's website, which is urc.ucdavis.edu. And under that website, we have several resources for getting started in creating effective academic posters. Before you start, there are several considerations that you should include, such as what is the context? How large does the poster need to be if you're printing the poster, for example? Who are the authors? And then a few others that I'll get into in a moment. As well as these general considerations before you get started, you also will see that we have many resources for creating posters for general, not necessarily only STEM. Below this, there are several templates that you can use to get started. So programs such as PowerPoint offer pre-designed templates that can be very useful with helping to create the structure, the layout of your poster. There are a few important questions to ask yourself when beginning to create a poster. For example, you want to think about what the most important aspect of your research is, because as I mentioned earlier, there's really no way to include all the details and all the data on a poster. So you want to make sure that you're getting the most important points across to your audience. Another important question to ask yourself is how can you best visually represent your research? So what subset of all your data, visual representations of your data, can you use to communicate to your audience what your research was about? And what kind of information can you also convey verbally alongside your poster? When you are giving your poster presentation, it's important to think about how to create a base that you can build off of in your verbal explanation. This could be bullet points or short abbreviations or visual aids that will help you when you're talking about your poster and your research. Also, what software do you want to use? PowerPoint is a popular program, but it's not the only one, so you may want to look into some other software programs that have additional features or options that appeal to you. Lastly, can you identify a few keywords or phrases that you want to use to describe your research? This is going to help you focus down to the main points that you wish to convey to your audience. What are the basic components of a research poster? Well, generally, they include elements that you might see in a scientific publication. You'll notice that an abstract is not included in this list because basically your poster represents a visual abstract of your research. So for this list, we're going to skip the abstract and go straight to the title. A title should be short and informative, and not include any jargon or field-specific terms that a general audience might be confused by. Your introduction should be brief and should introduce just the key points that are useful to understand the background of the project that you'll be talking about. Methods are often very abbreviated, sometimes just a few bullet points with an overview of how you conducted your research. This is something you can elaborate on when you give your verbal presentation with your poster. Results are a main component of the poster. So this is something you want to think about in detail. How can you best represent your results in a limited space? This is often done through visual representations such as graphs or tables. So think about how you can best represent the most important results from your project. Your discussion or conclusions are also an important component because this brings the so what component of the research. Why is this research important? Why should your audience member care about the research that you are conducting? So that's an important thing to consider about how to effectively communicate the importance of your research. Acknowledgements are always key, especially when you've received funding or other types of support from specific departments or specific people. That's always important to include that in your poster. And references can also be very abbreviated, but they're important to include, especially when you're including data that maybe you did not produce yourself in your poster. So it's always good to reference that. What text should be included in your poster? Well, even though this may be a poster that is presented at a digital conference, a virtual conference, for example, readability is still very important. In fact, it may be more important in a digital context because your audience may have a shorter attention span if they're sitting at home in front of their computer versus walking past your poster at a physical conference. The title is going to be the first thing that they look at, so it should be short, it should be readable, and usually placed somewhere really prominently on the poster. There's no specific word count for a poster. However, less is always more. So the fewer words you can include, probably the better. And that, again, you can complement with your verbal explanation of your poster. Any text that is included in the poster should be clear, visible, and to the point. The layout of the poster should progress in a logical sequence and have a flow. In other words, whoever is reading it should be able to move from one section to another and understand how the research was conducted in a logical fashion. This can include using bullet points, numbering, or headlines. But whatever you use, it should have a consistent and clean layout across the whole poster. So don't change your theme or your design from one section to another. Make sure you include acknowledgements, full author names and institutional affiliation, and any funding sources. This is important to include in your poster. And also remember that when you emphasize everything, for example, if you overuse boxes, bold fonts, underlined fonts, etc., it can be a little overwhelming visually to the viewer, so you want to use those sparingly. Less is more. The design of the poster is an important element that I think a lot of people underestimate. Humans are a visual species and we are influenced by what we see. So if you want to get your message across to your audience, it's important that they can receive that information effectively. So here are a few tips on that. You want to pick a consistent color palette. Generally that's 2 to 3 colors maximum, and you want to pick compatible colors or complementary colors. For example, if you've ever gone to see an action movie, you may notice that a lot of action movie posters include blue and orange color palettes. And that's because that's very visually appealing to us and it catches our eye. So spend a little time thinking about what colors might be complementary on your poster. This might be limited by the colors of your graphs and figures. So if you've already produced a visual representation of your data in a specific color palette, think about how you might design the rest of your poster to complement that image. Visual storytelling is a key component. So think about how your poster tells a story. And this may mean that you need to include additional images that don't convey a lot of data. So it could be that you're working with a test organism, a species that not a lot of people are familiar with. It might be worth taking up a little extra space to include just a picture of that organism so that you can familiarize your audience with your test organism. And lastly, make sure that you spend some time thinking about which are the best figures, tables, or graphs that tell the story, because you really can't fit all of them into the poster. A few interesting things to consider when thinking about the story that your data is telling are how to include elements of storytelling. So one example would be to use the and, but, therefore storytelling template. This is abbreviated as ABT. The way that this storytelling template works is you begin by communicating a series of pieces of information, and. Data point 1 and data point 2 and data point 3, for example. Once you've built that base of information that your audience needs in order to understand the background of your story, you then introduce a problem or some sort of scenario that needs to be addressed. And that is the B, the but part of the template. So you have all this background information, but no one has ever studied this, this, and this. Or, but we have a problem with this specific type of analysis that needs to be addressed. Lastly, you are going to present the therefore part of the ABT, the T, and that is going to convey to the audience how you plan to address the problem or to resolve whatever tension has been created in this storyline, if you're thinking a little more abstractly. So with that in mind, you're going to just give the pertinent information. So try not to over-explain in your introductory section of your poster. Present the challenge or the problem clearly so that your audience understands why this is important. And then, therefore, describe how your research addresses that problem. And this falls into a narrative structure that's very commonly used for many types of storytelling, not just for posters. But you're basically creating this tension with the viewer so that they feel invested in the outcome. They really want to understand what you've done and how you've addressed this problem because now they care about the problem. Many times in STEM disciplines, we fall into this danger of the and format, which is to introduce too many data points, too much information without building a story, without really telling the viewer what the main problem is or how you plan to resolve or address that problem. So that's something to be aware of. If you like more information about this ABT template, you can go to the web address listed here, or you can just Google ABT storytelling template. And there are lots of resources out there, including some great TED Talk videos. So let's look at some examples of really good posters. So this example has a very clear title with no jargon. It has a simple color palette. I see 3 colors maximum. It has clearly outlined sections that follow a layout or a flow that's easy for me to read from left to right. They've included some key figures and tables that give me a background about their research, but doesn't overwhelm me just to look at it. And they've also made room for a few extras. So if you see at the very center top, which is a point in the poster where your eye is drawn, they have put a picture that doesn't really give me a lot of information about the methods, the results, the conclusion. However, it draws me into the poster because now I'm more invested in the research based on my emotional reaction to the photo. You'll notice too that at the upper right, they've made room for all the funding agencies or agencies that supported the research in some way, as well as listing clearly the authors and their affiliated institutions. Let's look at another example. So for this one, this may be a group of organisms that not many people are familiar with. And so this author has included an image at the bottom left of the poster that shows her research organisms. So that's really helpful for me to take a look here and understand a little better what she is talking about. She's also included references, which is a much smaller font size, but still important to include in the bottom left, as well as acknowledgements in the bottom right corner. Again, she has some key information, some key results listed, maybe not everything that she generated in this project, but just enough so that I can get the main message of her project. And let's look at one more. So this one is fun because they have many different authors and they've included pictures of the authors at the top as well as the plants that the research was based around. So this gives a little more of a human impact here because you see the faces of the researchers. Each section is very clearly labeled. They have a lot of interesting imagery to include, as well as some data-rich imagery as well, some results tables and graphs. And The acknowledgement section is also clear, very visually strong. Again, a simple color palette. The graphs are the most colorful element on the poster, and so your eye is probably drawn there as well as to the faces of the authors. So now that we've had a chance to look at some good examples, let's look at some not so good examples. So this isn't to say that this research wasn't amazing or groundbreaking or scientifically sound. It's just to say that the authors didn't really think about how it was visually presented very well. So what do we see? We see a very small title that's hard to read, not a lot of contrast in color, so there isn't really anything that draws your eye to one section or another. There's a lot of text here, so immediately I'm a little overwhelmed looking at all this text. And no figure, so they have a table, but they don't include any figures that visually summarize the data. And again, your poster is a visual representation. It's a visual summary of your data. So be sure to include some sort of figure, graph, picture, table, whatever you have. Let's look at another example. So for this example, it's very hard to read. They've chosen a dark background and they've put a dark text over that dark background. So not a lot of contrast between the color of the text and the background, and that makes it really difficult for someone to walk up and read. So even though their title font is a good size, they have a good clear layout, and even they even have some really strong images included, it's not as strong of a poster as one that has higher contrast. So you can really do yourself a disservice by not including contrast and a good color palette. So hopefully this has given you some information about important components to make your poster effective and easily readable by your audience. Some things to avoid: poor design and layout, poor choice of color or contrast. If it's too crowded or if there's a wall of text, that can be really visually overwhelming for your audience, as well as an ineffective use of tables and figures and graphs. So that could mean that you have too many or too few, or not the right ones, that are, maybe you have some that are more confusing. So with that said, you can also find additional information and resources at our website, urc.ucdavis.edu. And we hope that this tutorial has been helpful in your process for making your own academic poster. And we hope to see you also at our conference. Thanks so much for watching.